The door to the Harlan Creek Land Office slammed open so hard the glass in the window rattled in its frame, and Caroline Langston felt her blood run cold before she even turned around to see who had walked in. She knew. She knew the way a person knows a storm is coming before a single cloud appears on the horizon, that particular pressure in the chest, that tightening behind the eyes. She had been standing at the clerk's counter for 20 minutes, her deed paperwork spread out before her, watching old Elmer Grady dip his pen and scratch notations into his ledger, with the slow, grinding patience of a man who had never once been in a hurry in all his 63 years. And now those 20 minutes, that careful preparation, the early morning ride from the Langston homestead, all of it was about to be undone. Margaret Pollard, Caroline said quietly, not making it a greeting, just a name, just an acknowledgement of the worst possible timing in the history of Harlan Creek, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1879. Margaret Pollard was everything Caroline Langston was not, which was precisely the problem. Margaret was tall where Caroline was slight, polished where Caroline was plain worn, and funded where Caroline was one drought season away from losing everything her late husband Thomas had built with his own two bleeding hands. Margaret walked into that land office like she owned it, which was exactly what she intended to accomplish by the time she walked back out. "Why, Caroline," Margaret said, her voice carrying that honeyed edge that could cut glass. "What a surprise! I didn't expect to find you here this morning." "I imagine not," Caroline said. She turned back to Elmer Grady and placed both hands flat on the counter. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain the old clerk could hear it. "Mr. Grady, I need you to file that deed extension today. Today, please. I have the paperwork completed and I have the filing fee." Elmer Grady looked up from his ledger and then looked past Caroline's shoulder to Margaret Pollard, and in that single shifting of his rheumy eyes, Caroline understood exactly how bad this situation truly was. "Well now, Mrs. Langston," Grady began, setting down his pen with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words like a surgeon choosing a blade, "there's a complication this morning, I'm afraid." "What complication?" Caroline's voice was steady. She was proud of that. Inside she was falling. "Miss Pollard here filed a competing claim on the southern parcel of your late husband's property this past Monday. Says there was an undisclosed lien, and she's got documentation from the Cattlemen's Bank in Abilene that..." The door burst open again. Every head in the room turned. Elmer Grady knocked his inkwell. Margaret Pollard spun on her heel. And Caroline Langston turned to see Henry Holloway standing in the doorway of the Harlan Creek Land Office, chest heaving, his gray hat pushed back on his head and his dark eyes moving over the room with the focused intensity of a man who had ridden very hard, very fast, and was not done yet. He had never moved faster in his life. That much was plain to see. His gaze found Caroline immediately, and something in the set of his jaw shifted, some relief passing through the tension in his face before he locked it back down. "Morning, Elmer," Henry said, stepping fully inside and letting the door swing shut behind him. "Got here just in time, I see." Henry Holloway was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that the son had spent years honestly working on. He was not a man who sought attention, and he was not a man who drew it easily. But he had a way of walking into a room that made the room rearrange itself around him, like furniture sliding to accommodate a force of nature that didn't ask permission to enter. He crossed to the counter and stood beside Caroline, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his arm. "What's the status of Mrs. Langston's filing?" Henry asked, addressing Elmer directly. "Henry Holloway," Margaret said, her voice sharpening, "this is a private legal matter and it is none of your concern." Henry didn't look at Margaret. He kept his eyes on Elmer Grady. "I didn't hear that it was your matter to define, Miss Pollard." Caroline stared at Henry. She had known him for 6 months. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times, at the general store, at Sunday services, once at the Harlan Creek social when he had asked her to dance, and she had said no because it had felt too soon, too tender, and she had been afraid of herself more than afraid of him. She had never expected him to come flying through that door like salvation on horseback. "The competing claim," Elmer Grady said, shuffling papers with guilty haste, "was filed Monday last. Mrs. Langston's deed extension deadline is today at noon. If she files before noon with the full documentation, the competing claim becomes secondary pending adjudication. But if she doesn't file in the next," he pulled out a pocket watch and squinted at it, "48 minutes, the claim goes into contest and Miss Pollard's filing takes precedence." "Then let's file," Henry said. He looked at Caroline. "You have everything." "I have everything," Caroline said. She held his gaze for one long second. There was a question in her eyes that had nothing to do with deeds and filing fees and competing claims, and she could see that he understood it perfectly. "Why are you here? Why did you come? What does this cost you, and what do you expect in return?" Henry just gave her a small, certain nod, the way a man nods when he has already calculated the risk and decided it doesn't matter. "Then let's file," he said again, gently. 3 weeks earlier, Caroline Langston had been standing at her kitchen window watching a dust devil spin itself across the dry southwestern pasture and thinking about how much her life had changed in the 14 months since Thomas died. She was 30 years old. She had a 240-acre homestead, a herd of 60 cattle down from the 90 they'd had before the drought, a 15-year-old son named James who was doing the work of a grown man and had been since the funeral, and a stubbornness in her that had carried her through things that should have broken her twice over. Thomas Langston had been a good man. Not a perfect man, not a man without his demons, but a good one, and she had loved him with the steady kind of love that builds itself on daily acts rather than grand gestures. When he died of a fever in the autumn of 1878, she had grieved him with the same quiet determination with which she had loved him. She had not fallen apart. She had not given up the land. She had told James they were going to be all right, and she had meant every word of it. What she had not counted on was Margaret Pollard. Margaret had come to Harlan Creek 6 months after Thomas died, arriving from San Antonio in a lacquered coach with leather luggage and letters of introduction from 2 bank presidents and a state senator. She was a widow herself, 35, and she had capital where everyone else in the county had debt. She had bought the Reardon property on the north end of town within 2 weeks of arriving, renovated it, and opened what she called a guest house, which was really just the finest private residence in a 20-mile radius dressed up with a spare bedroom and a justification. People liked Margaret Pollard, or at least they liked what she could do for them. She lent money. She sponsored improvements. She bought cattle at fair prices. She was charming and sharp and well-connected, and Caroline had watched all of it with the mild, careful wariness of someone who had learned not to trust gifts. And then the gifts had stopped being gifts. It had started with the fence line. Margaret claimed that the southern boundary of the Langston property extended a 1/4 mile onto what she said was undeeded territory, and that she had filed a homestead claim on that territory based on prior use provisions in the Texas Land Code. It was technically possible. It was also, in Caroline's opinion, an act of deliberate aggression dressed up in legal language. Caroline had ridden to the county seat in Millbrook and spoken with a land attorney named Beaumont, who had confirmed that her deed covered the land in question, but that the process of clarifying the contest would require a certified extension filing at the Harlan Creek office by no later than the 15th of the month. She had exactly the right paperwork. She had the filing fee in coin. She had set out that morning before dawn to get it done. What she had not anticipated was Margaret being there. What she had entirely not anticipated was Henry Holloway. She had first really noticed Henry Holloway at the general store in early spring. He ran a cattle operation of about 400 acres to the west of town, modest by Texas standards but well managed. And he had the reputation of being a man who kept his word, which in Harlan Creek in 1879 was worth considerably more than a man who kept his bank balance. He had a hired hand named Cook and a dog named Chester who followed him everywhere, and he lived alone in a house he had built himself 2 years prior after coming west from Tennessee. She had noticed him at the general store because he had done something unexpected. Old Clara Medina, who was maybe 70 and spoke almost no English and had lived at the edge of town with her grandson since the boy's parents died in a flood, had been turned away from the counter by the storekeeper Aldrich because her grandson had gotten behind on their tab. Clara didn't understand the dismissal and had stood there, confused and embarrassed, clutching a list she couldn't read aloud. Henry had walked in during this scene, had sized it up in about 3 seconds, and had said quietly to Aldrich, "Put whatever she needs on my account." And then he had helped Clara understand, gesturing and using the few Spanish words he knew, which were not many but were offered with such goodwill that Clara had patted his hand and said something in Spanish that made her eyes fill. Caroline had watched all of this from behind a display of dry goods, and something in her chest had done an entirely unwelcome thing. A loosening, a warmth, the particular, dangerous warmth of recognizing a quality in a person that you had almost convinced yourself didn't exist in the world anymore. She had walked out without buying what she came for, and had spent the ride home telling herself firmly that she was not the sort of woman who formed impressions of men based on a single act of decency at a general store. She was, as it turned out, exactly that sort of woman. They had spoken for the first time properly a week later, when Henry's cattle had broken through a damaged section of the fence line between his property and Thomas's old south pasture, and Henry had come to tell her about it before she found out herself and thought he'd done it on purpose. He had stood at her porch hat in hand and apologized for the fence damage and offered to repair it at his own expense, and Caroline had stood in her doorway and studied him and said, "I'll split the cost with you, it's an old fence." He had looked surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't, I'm choosing to." There had been a small silence, and then Henry Holloway had smiled. Not a wide, performative smile, but the real kind, the kind that rearranges a man's face completely when it arrives unexpectedly. "All right," he'd said. "Fair enough." They had spent that afternoon mending fence together. Caroline and James on one side, Henry and his man Cook on the other. It was hard, blistering work, and they hadn't talked much, but there was a comfort in the shared labor that Caroline hadn't felt in a long time. The sense of working alongside someone whose presence you trusted even when you didn't yet know the full shape of it. James had liked Henry immediately, which was significant. James was not a boy who warmed to people quickly. He had his mother's watchfulness and his father's directness, and he had learned too young that people sometimes wanted things from them, from the land, from the cattle, and that liking someone too fast could cost you. But Henry had talked to James like a person, not a boy, had asked him real questions about the cattle operation and listened to the answers, and by the end of the afternoon James had decided Henry Holloway was all right. Caroline had not gone so far. Not yet. Over the following weeks, Henry had found natural occasions to be near. Not intrusive occasions, nothing that could be called pursuit, just the ordinary proximity of two neighboring landowners in a small Texas county who happened to encounter each other at the feed store, at the community well, at the Sunday service where Reverend Cates preached with more volume than theology. Henry was always courteous, always careful. He never presumed. She had come to look forward to those encounters in a way she refused to examine too closely. The night before the land office confrontation, Henry had found out from Tom Bauer at the feed store that Margaret Pollard had filed a competing claim on the Langston southern parcel, and that Caroline's deadline was the following morning. Tom had mentioned it the way people in small towns mention things, not as an emergency, just as news. "I guess Caroline Langston's going to have a fight on her hands tomorrow," Tom had said, weighing out oats. Henry had ridden home, fed his horse, sat down at his kitchen table and stared at the wall for 10 minutes. Then he had ridden to Caroline's house. She had answered the door at nearly 8 in the evening with flour on her hands and James appearing behind her shoulder like a small, suspicious guardian, and Henry had stood on her porch and said, "I heard about the Pollard filing." Caroline had gone still. "How did you hear?" Tom Bauer. He wasn't spreading it to be unkind, I don't think. He just didn't understand what it meant. "And you do?" "I grew up in Tennessee," Henry said. "My father had a land dispute that lasted 4 years and cost him most of what he built. I understand exactly what a competing claim filed at the right moment can do." She had studied him. The porch light was a single lamp hung beside the door, and it threw warm gold across half his face. There was something in his expression that she was only beginning to learn to read, a careful honesty that sat just below the surface of everything he said. "I'm going to the office first thing in the morning," she said. "I have everything I need." "I know you do," Henry said. "I'd like to come with you." The silence stretched out between them. "Why?" Caroline asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because Margaret Pollard didn't file that claim by accident. She filed it because she knows you'll be alone, and she's counting on that to shake you. I'd like to make sure she's wrong about that part." Caroline had meant to say something measured and independent, something about handling her own affairs, which was the truth and also a point of pride. What came out instead was, "All right." She had regretted it for about 2 hours that night, lying awake listening to the wind move through the mesquite outside her window, wondering what she was doing letting a man she was not sure she could trust into a situation that could decide the future of everything Thomas had built. And then she had stopped regretting it and started being honest with herself, which was a different, more uncomfortable process. She trusted Henry Holloway. She didn't entirely understand why or what to do with it, but she trusted him the way you trust a solid floor under your feet, not because you've tested it, but because it hasn't given way when you stepped on it. The morning had come fast. Back in the land office, with 48 minutes on the clock and Margaret Pollard standing behind her radiating the cold fury of a woman who had not anticipated opposition, Caroline laid her paperwork on Elmer Grady's counter and walked through it piece by piece, point by point, with the methodical calm of someone who had prepared for this moment and was not going to let nerves undo the preparation. Henry stood beside her. He didn't speak unless asked. He didn't take over. He was simply present in that particular way of his, solid and steady, and when Margaret tried to interject twice about the legitimacy of Caroline's deed interpretation, Henry turned slowly and said, "I'd let the clerk do his job, Miss Pollard," with such quiet authority that Margaret stopped. Elmer Grady stamped the deed extension at 11:47 in the morning, 13 minutes to spare. Caroline put the stamped document into her leather satchel and buckled it shut and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of relief before she picked up the satchel, turned around, and walked toward the door. She heard Margaret say something sharp and low behind her, something about lawyers and Abilene and this not being finished, and she didn't stop walking. Henry held the door. Outside, the Harlan Creek Main Street was going about its business in the heat of mid-morning, wagons rolling, a group of ranch hands crossing at the far end, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out a steady rhythm from the open smithy. The world had continued on, indifferent to the 48-minute battle that had just been won inside an office not much bigger than a generous pantry. Caroline stood on the boardwalk and breathed. "You did that," Henry said. He was standing a step behind her to her left. "We did that," she said. "You had everything you needed before I walked in. I just stood there." "You stood there at exactly the right time." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that careful, honest expression that she was getting better at reading. "Thank you, Henry," he nodded, and the nod carried the same weight as everything he said, measured and real. She should have left it there. She should have thanked him again and ridden back to the homestead and resumed the business of running a cattle operation with a 15-year-old and 60 head of beef through the rest of a dry Texas summer. Instead, she heard herself say, "Will you have dinner with James and me tonight? I make a reasonable steak." The surprise on his face was brief but genuine, and then the smile came, the real one. "I'd be honored," Henry said. That evening was the beginning of something. Caroline would understand that later, looking back. At the time it was just dinner, just 3 people around a kitchen table with decent beef and corn bread, and a conversation that ranged from cattle prices to James's ambitions about eventually going to a proper school in Austin, to an argument Henry and James had about whether the new Winchester repeating rifle was superior to the Springfield, which Caroline stayed out of on the grounds that she preferred not to referee debates about firearms while eating. But there were moments, small, clear moments, when Henry caught Caroline looking at him across the table, and instead of glancing away, held the look for a count of 2 before looking down at his plate. When James said something that made both Henry and Caroline laugh at exactly the same time, the same genuine, unguarded laugh, and they looked at each other in the aftermath of it with the shared recognition of people who find the same things funny. When Henry, helping Caroline clear the dishes after James had excused himself to attend to the evening chores, accidentally put his hand over hers reaching for the same plate, and neither of them pulled away for a moment longer than accidental. It was that last one that stayed with her after he rode away. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the darkness close over the place where his lantern had disappeared between the live oaks, and she thought about Thomas. Not with grief exactly, or at least not only with grief, with a kind of tender, sorrowful permission. "I loved you," she thought. "I love you still in all the ways that don't go away, but I am still here, and I am only 30 years old, and the world has not stopped." She was not sure Thomas would have argued with that. He had never been a man who wanted her to suffer. Over the weeks that followed, Henry became a regular presence at the Langston homestead, and Caroline became a regular presence at his. They worked through the fence repairs together fully, then through the business of planning for the autumn cattle drive, then through the unexpected crisis of a water hole on Henry's property going dry in James, and Henry spending 3 days digging an extension from the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. Caroline brought food and assessed the project with the practical eye of a woman who had spent 11 years running a working ranch and knew when a plan was good, and when it was going to end in mud and regret. She was usually right. Henry accepted her corrections with the grace of a man who was secure enough not to be threatened by someone else being right. They talked in the evenings, on porches and over kitchen tables, and once memorably, sitting on a flat boulder beside the creek, while the water ran past them in the late orange light of a September evening. They talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, about their pasts and their fears and their plans, and the talking became the kind of talking where you stop thinking about what to say next because you've stopped being afraid of what comes out. He told her about Tennessee. His father had been a farmer, a stubborn, proud man who had built something real but lost it to the land dispute he'd mentioned on her porch. Henry had come west at 25 partly to build something of his own and partly to get far enough away from the grief of watching his father lose everything that he could breathe again. He had been in Harlan Creek for 3 years. He was good at the work. He had not been good, he admitted, at the solitude. "You seem comfortable alone," Caroline said. "I've learned to be," Henry said. "Comfortable and happy are different things." She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "Yes," she said, "they are." He had asked about Thomas gently, without prying, and she had talked about him honestly, about his goodness and his silences and the particular kind of marriage they had had, loving and imperfect and real. Henry listened without comparing and without filling the space with assurances. He just listened, and when she finished, he said, "He sounds like a man who would have built something worth keeping." "He did," Caroline said, "and I'm going to keep it." "I know you are," Henry said. They were sitting close enough on that rock that their arms were almost touching, and Caroline was acutely aware of that almost. She was aware of it in the way that meant she was fighting it, that small, warm, magnetic pull that she had been managing for weeks now with a combination of practicality and self-discipline. Henry shifted, and his arms settled against hers. Neither of them moved away. Neither of them said anything. The creek ran. The light went amber and then deep gold and then the blue of early evening. a hawk called somewhere high up and invisible. Henry turned his head to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and the distance between them was very small. "Caroline," he said. His voice was different than his usual voice, quieter and rougher and more careful all at once. "I know," she said. Because she did. "I'm not going to rush you," he said. "I need you to know that. Whatever this is, whatever pace it needs to move at, that's the pace it'll move." Something behind her ribs shifted. She had expected, even prepared for, the possibility that a man who had been kind might become a man who pushed, who expected, who moved the goalposts once he thought he'd earned the right. It was not an unreasonable expectation in 1879 Texas. It was, in fact, a very reasonable one. And Henry had just looked at her with complete honesty and said the exact opposite of everything she'd been quietly bracing for. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the rock. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "I just needed to know you knew that I wasn't." He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the stars came out over Harlan Creek, and when they finally walked back toward the horses, it was with the particular lightness of two people who have resolved something that had been unresolved for a long time. October came in with a cold edge that reminded everyone in South Texas that even the warmest climates had teeth. The cattle drive to the railhead at Abilene was the central business of that month, and for the Langston operation it was critical. 60 head, carefully fattened through the summer, represented the majority of Caroline's income for the year. If the drive went well, she could pay the property tax, cover winter supplies, put aside a small reserve for spring, and rest at least marginally easier. If it went badly, she would be back to the edge of difficulty, where one more thing going wrong meant real trouble. Henry had offered to combine drives, his cattle and hers together, sharing the cost of trail hands for the journey north to the railhead. It was a practical arrangement, and they both knew it, but it was also an acknowledgement of something, of the way their two operations had become intertwined, of the way they had each quietly begun to plan with the other in mind. They hired 3 additional hands, experienced men that Henry knew from previous drives, and set out with a combined herd of near 300 head on the 12th of October. James came, insisting with the fierce determination of someone who had been pulling adult weight since he was 14, and had no intention of being left behind now. Caroline let him come because refusing would have been both impractical and dishonest. She needed him. He was good, and he knew it. The drive north was 10 days of hard, honest work, dust and noise and the constant management of cattle who had their own opinions about the direction they were supposed to be moving. Long days in the saddle, short nights around a fire, food that was hot and plain and welcome after hours of exhaustion. Caroline worked every bit as hard as any of the hired hands and expected no different treatment, which earned her a kind of quiet respect from men who had not been sure what to make of a woman in the saddle at the head of a drive. Henry rode beside her for hours at a stretch, and they talked when they had breath for it and were silent when they didn't, and both the talking and the silence were easy, which felt like the most important thing. On the 4th night out, when the herd had settled and the hands were asleep and James was on first watch at the far edge of camp, Henry and Caroline sat by the remains of the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, and Henry took off his hat and turned it in his hands and said, without preamble and without apparent strategy, "I love you, Caroline." She looked at him. The firelight was low and gold on his face, and his expression was open and a little vulnerable and entirely unguarded. "That's direct," she said. "You've told me you don't like to be managed," he said. "I figured direct was the appropriate approach." She turned her tin cup in her hands. Around them the Texas night was enormous and quiet, full of stars and the distant sound of cattle settling. She thought about what it meant to love and to be loved, about what it cost and what it gave, about the 14 months since Thomas, about the strange, unlikely gift of finding yourself at 30 on a cattle drive, beside a man who looked at you like you were something worth finding. "I love you too," she said. It came out without struggle because it was simply true. Henry exhaled, a long, slow breath as though he'd been holding it since September. He reached across the space between them and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a careful hand, and she leaned into it the slightest bit, just enough to say yes, and he kissed her, softly and without urgency, the kind of kiss that isn't trying to become something else, that is content to be exactly what it is. When they pulled back, Caroline looked at him and said, "You're going to tell me this changes everything, aren't you?" "It changes some things," Henry said. "I'll let you decide which ones." She laughed, quietly so as not to wake the hands, and leaned her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her and they sat like that for a long time, watching the fire go to coals, while the herd breathed and the stars turned. The drive reached Abilene on schedule. The sale went well. Caroline's 60 head brought a solid price, enough to cover everything she'd calculated and then some. She stood at the rail yard, watching the last of them loaded, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing completed through pure, sustained effort. Henry's 400 finished loading an hour later, and he found her sitting on a fence rail with her hat off and her face tilted up to the midday Kansas sun, just breathing. "Good price?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "Good enough for winter and then some." She opened one eye and looked at him sideways. "Yours? Good enough that I've been thinking about some improvements to the south pasture fencing I've been putting off," he said. "You and your fences," she said. "To be fair, a fence is what introduced us," Henry said. She laughed and jumped down from the rail, and they walked together down the Abilene Main Street, which was bigger and louder and considerably more chaotic than Harlan Creek, and had lunch at a restaurant with tablecloths and actual menus, which James stared at with wide eyes, and then pretended he'd seen menus 100 times. "He's a good boy," Henry said quietly to Caroline while James was concentrating on deciphering the handwritten menu. "He's extraordinary," Caroline said. "He's been the man of that homestead since he was 14, and he's never once complained. He takes after his mother. He takes after both of them," Caroline said. "Thomas was stubborn and capable and didn't believe in complaining either." Henry nodded, accepting that. He had learned to accept the presence of Thomas in these conversations without tension, which was not something Caroline had taken for granted. It would have been easy, human, understandable for him to feel competitive about a ghost. He didn't. He seemed to understand that Thomas was not a competitor but a context, part of who she was and how she loved, and loving her meant accepting the whole of that. They returned to Harlan Creek on a fine late October afternoon, the drive behind them and a satisfying weight of success in the saddlebags. The county looked different coming back to it, as a place you've chosen always looks different than a place you've simply inherited. The hills rolled amber and dusty green, the river glinted where it curved near the south boundary of Henry's property, and the town of Harlan Creek sat in its shallow valley looking small and permanent and home. Margaret Pollard was waiting. Not literally, not in the road, but her lawyer from Abilene had arrived in their absence. A sharp-faced man named Holt with expensive boots and a document case, and he had filed an additional motion at the land office claiming that the November deed extension that Elmer Grady had stamped was procedurally irregular, because a previously registered lien from Thomas Langston's original purchase had never been formally discharged, and therefore constituted an encumbrance on any subsequent filing. Caroline found out about it from Reverend Cates, who found out about it from his wife, who had heard Holt talking at the guest house, which was to say she found out about it the way you find out about anything in a small Texas town, through a chain of concerned neighbors who each felt slightly guilty about being the one to tell you. She stood in her kitchen that evening and read the notice that had been left with her neighbor Mrs. Abbott to give to her, and the specific coldness she felt was not panic. It was something older and calmer and harder than panic. It was the particular resolve of a woman who had survived enough to know that surviving was what you did. You just did it again and again, until the thing trying to break you gave up. Henry came over. She had not sent for him, but he came, because somehow he knew, perhaps from Tom Bauer again, or perhaps from the instinct of a man who had been paying attention. He knocked, came in when she called, saw her sitting at the kitchen table with the notice in her hand, and sat down across from her without saying anything. She handed him the notice. He read it. "Lien from the original purchase," he said. "Thomas told me it was discharged in '73, Caroline said. He said he had the paper from the bank in Millbrook. Do you have that paper?" "I don't know." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas kept his business papers in a strongbox in the study. I haven't gone through everything in it. I went through enough to manage the immediate things after he died, and then I couldn't make myself do the rest." She paused. "I need to look. Do you want help?" she considered. Going through Thomas's papers was something she had been avoiding for over a year, not out of irresponsibility but out of the particular grief of it, the intimacy of a dead person's handwriting, the way his business papers would be full of his particular notations and abbreviations, and the penmanship that she had known as well as her own name. It would be hard. Having Henry beside her would make it easier. "Yes," she said. The strongbox was in the study, which had been Thomas's room in the house the way the kitchen was Caroline's, a room where he had worked and planned and sat in the evenings with his ledger. It smelled of him still, faintly, that particular combination of leather and tobacco, and the cedar chest where he kept his good coat. Caroline stood in the doorway for a moment before she crossed to the desk. Henry stood behind her, giving her the space of that moment. She opened the strongbox with the key she kept on a chain around her neck, and they went through it together, carefully, document by document. Thomas's papers were organized in the way of a man who was particular about some things and not about others. The important documents were grouped and folded precisely, but intermixed with letters and receipts and notes in his own shorthand that took Caroline a moment to decode each time. 20 minutes in, she found it. A single folded paper, the discharge from the Millbrook Cattlemen's Bank, dated April of 1873, confirming the satisfaction of the original purchase lien on the Langston property with all details specified. Thomas's signature at the bottom, and the bank officer's countersignature beside it. Caroline held it under the lamp and read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and put her hands flat on the surface and leaned on them, just breathing. Henry looked at the document without picking it up. "That's it," he said. "That's it," Caroline confirmed. "Holt and Pollard either knew this existed and were gambling you didn't have the copy, or they didn't know and were working from incomplete information. Either way," Caroline said, "I'm going to take this to the land office first thing tomorrow." "And to a lawyer," Henry said. "Not Beaumont in Millbrook, someone sharper. There's a man in San Antonio, I've heard of him, Curtis Malone. He deals specifically with land cases. He could advise you on whether Pollard's conduct constitutes an actionable claim." Caroline straightened up. "You've been thinking about this." "Since we got back," he admitted. "I've been thinking about it since before we left, honestly. The pattern of it, the competing claim, the lien, the timing, none of this is accidental. She's methodical. That means she has a larger goal." "The land," Caroline said. "She wants the southern parcel for the cattle road access. If she controls the southern boundary of my property, she controls the only practical access route from her north range to the open grazing on the Hillman Plateau." Henry stared at her. "How long have you known that?" "Since August," Caroline said, "when I looked at a survey map and traced what she'd gained from each move she's made." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't sure then how much I trusted you," she said honestly. A pause. "And now, I trust you completely," she said, also honestly. Henry looked at her across the desk, across the strongbox and Thomas's papers and the lamplit evening, and something in his expression was warm and serious at the same time. "All right," he said. "Then we go forward together on this." She nodded. "Together." The next morning, she filed the discharge document at the land office. Elmer Grady stamped it with the same slow precision he stamped everything, and the encumbrance challenge was officially nullified before noon. Holt, Margaret Pollard's lawyer, attempted a counterargument that afternoon, but Elmer Grady had, to his credit, a stubborn commitment to the paperwork in front of him, and the paperwork was clear. The lien had been discharged in 1873. It was not a valid basis for an encumbrance challenge in 1879. Holt packed his document case and left on the evening stage. Margaret Pollard did not leave. She was not the kind of woman who left. But she was quiet for a while, and quiet from Margaret Pollard was its own kind of message. She was regrouping. She was patient. She had capital and connections and a long view, and Caroline knew that this was not over. November brought the hard north winds and the beginning of the cold season that settled over the Texas hill country like a gray wool blanket, heavy and close. The cattle were moved to the winter pasture. Wood was cut and stacked. The homestead pulled in on itself the way working properties do in winter, smaller and denser, focused on the essentials. Henry came over nearly every day. Sometimes there was a practical reason, a fence concern or a shared resource question, or the communal work of preparing both properties for cold weather. Sometimes there was no reason except that it was easier to be there than not to be. He and James fell into the easy rhythm of people who respect each other, working side by side without the need for direction, the kind of functional partnership that takes time to build and feels, once built, like it was always there. Caroline watched the two of them from the kitchen window sometimes, Henry and James in the barn or in the yard, and felt something she had not felt in over a year. The sense of a complete thing, not perfect, not without its complications and sorrows, but complete in the way a working household is complete, full of movement and purpose, and the particular warmth of shared effort. James, who was not given to emotional declarations, told her one evening in a quiet, offhand way, the way teenage boys communicate important things, "I like Henry." "I know," Caroline said. "I think he's going to ask you to marry him," James said. Caroline set down the dish she was drying. "What makes you say that?" James shrugged, which was his way of saying the evidence is overwhelming and you already know this. "He looks at you the way Pa used to when he thought you weren't watching." She stood there for a moment, very still. "Would that be all right with you?" she asked. James was quiet for a count of 3, which meant he was taking the question seriously. "Then Pa would have liked him," he said. "I think that's the right way to think about it." Caroline turned away to the window before James could see that her eyes had filled. Henry did ask. He asked in December, just after the first real frost had laid a thin silver lacework across the dead grass of the south pasture, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold. He asked her on her own porch, in the early evening when the stars were just beginning to show, and he asked her in the direct, unadorned way that was characteristic of everything he did. "I want to spend the rest of my life working beside you," he said. "I want to be there when things are hard and when they're good, and I want James to have someone to learn from and to argue with who'll hold his ground. And I love you, Caroline. I loved you before I knew I was going to, and I love you more clearly every day." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She had known it was coming. James had predicted it, and she had felt it approaching for weeks. And still, standing there in the cold December air with the star-frosted sky above them and Henry Holloway looking at her with everything plain in his face, she felt the full force of it, the improbability and the grace of being offered this, again, a different thing than what she'd had before but no less real. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He kissed her, and it was different from the cattle drive kiss, less tentative, more certain, the kiss of two people who have negotiated something significant and are now beginning. They set the date for February of 1880. Winter weddings were practical on a working ranch, the slowest season, the least disruption to the work. Reverend Cates performed ceremonies at the church and was notoriously susceptible to being booked on short notice, which was a useful quality in a minister. Margaret Pollard made one more move before the year was out. She did it through the County Water Rights Office, which was a different jurisdiction from the Land Office and handled by a different clerk, a younger man named Duffy who was newer to the role and, Caroline suspected, somewhat more susceptible to Margaret's particular brand of persuasion. She filed a claim on the creek water rights that affected both the Langston and the Holloway properties. Arguing prior appropriation based on the use of a stock pond she had built on her northern property that drew from the same watershed. Henry found out about it and came to Caroline with the documentation, and they sat at her kitchen table in December lamplight and went through it together. And the thing that Caroline noticed was not the content of the filing but the timing. Margaret had filed this the day after the engagement was announced at Sunday service. "She's not going after the land anymore," Caroline said slowly, following the logic. "Or not only the land, she's after leverage. If she controls the water rights to this watershed, she controls both our operations." Henry was quiet, reading the filing. "And she knows," Caroline continued, "that two operations tied together by a marriage contract are more vulnerable to a single disrupting action than two separate ones." "She planned for this," Henry said. "She planned for us," Caroline said. Henry set the document down. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize, the particular focus of a man who is working through a problem and has just arrived at the approach. "Curtis Malone," he said, "the lawyer in San Antonio. I'm going to write to him today, and I want you to send a letter from you as well. I also want you to write to your land attorney in Millbrook and ask him to request the complete filing records from the Water Rights Office, every document Pollard has submitted in the past year, every clerk she's spoken to, every transaction." "You think there's a pattern of coercion," Caroline said. "I think if we look at every move she's made since she arrived in Harlan Creek, there is a pattern, and I think that pattern is going to be useful to put in front of a judge." They wrote the letters that evening. Curtis Malone's reply came in 3 weeks, and it was better than they had hoped. He had heard of similar water rights maneuvers in other Texas counties and had successfully argued the relevant prior use provisions in 2 prior cases. He was prepared to take the case. His fee was substantial, but within range of what Caroline's cattle sale had covered. He came to Harlan Creek in January, a compact, methodical man with spectacles and a briefcase, who spent 2 days reviewing documents, interviewing Caroline and Henry and Elmer Grady and young Duffy at the Water Rights Office, and then requested a meeting with Margaret Pollard's lawyer. Holt had returned by then, summoned back by his client, and he met with Malone at the guest house on a cold January afternoon. Whatever was said in that meeting, the outcome was visible in the Water Rights Office the following morning, when a formal withdrawal of the prior appropriation claim appeared in Duffy's records, signed by Holt on behalf of his client. Malone explained it to Caroline and Henry over dinner at the hotel restaurant. "The filing was not fraudulent on its face," he said carefully, "but the basis for the prior appropriation claim required proving that Miss Pollard's use of the watershed predated yours, and she cannot prove that because it does not. Once I laid out exactly what the court review would find, the withdrawal was the rational choice." "She'll try something else," Caroline said. "Possibly," Malone said, "but she's now made 3 moves in this county, all 3 of which have failed and all of which are documented. If she continues, the pattern itself becomes actionable. I've told Holt as much clearly. I believe she understands the new landscape." He was right. Margaret Pollard made no further moves against the Langston or Holloway properties. It would be too much to say she left town. She didn't leave town. She was too invested in her guest house and her local connections to abandon Harlan Creek, simply because a pair of stubborn ranchers had outmaneuvered her. But the quality of her attention shifted. She turned it toward other things, other investments, other social ambitions, and if she looked at Caroline Langston across the Sunday service with an expression of cold, careful acknowledgement, at least she looked at her with the acknowledgement due someone who had held her ground. Caroline found, to her own surprise, that she bore Margaret no particular bitterness. The woman had tried to take what wasn't hers, and she had failed. That was the end of the story as far as Caroline was concerned. She had more important things to think about, like a February wedding. The wedding of Caroline Langston and Henry Holloway took place on the 14th of February, 1880, at the Harlan Creek Church of Reverend Cates, on a clear, cold morning that was bright with winter sun. The building was small and plainly built, but someone, it turned out to be Clara Medina and her grandson, had brought dried flowers from wherever dried flowers could be found in February in Texas, and tied them in small bunches along the ends of every pew with strips of ribbon, so that the church looked more festive than its daily self. James stood beside Henry as his best man, which had been Henry's request and James's quiet pride. Caroline came in on the arm of her nearest neighbor, elderly Phineas Cole, who had known Thomas and knew what this day was, and held her arm with the care of a man who understood its weight. She wore her good gray dress with the white collar, and she had braided her dark hair up in a way she didn't usually bother with, and Henry, in his good coat and a clean white shirt that he had clearly ironed himself because the collar was slightly uneven, looked at her when she came through the door with an expression that the whole congregation could read without any difficulty at all. Reverend Cates performed the ceremony with more grace than his Sunday sermons usually suggested he was capable of, perhaps because the occasion called it out of him. He kept it simple and true, which was the right call. When Henry said, "I do," his voice was level and clear and entirely certain. When Caroline said it, she meant it with every part of herself. The reception was at the homestead, which was now the Holloway homestead, which was a strange and good thing to think. Neighbors had brought food, the way they do in small towns when something worth celebrating happens, and the kitchen and the front room were crowded with people and noise and laughter. And James, who was 16 now and had not stopped growing, stood in the middle of it looking both very young and very old at once. Henry found Caroline at the edge of the front room, slightly away from the main crowd, and stood beside her with a glass of punch that they were both pretending was festive. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I've done something right," she said. He looked at her with that particular warmth that was his alone. "You have," he said. "So have I." They moved his belongings to the homestead over the following week, integrating two households with the practical, negotiated process that is both mundane and oddly intimate, deciding whose cast iron pan was better, and where his books should go, and what to do with two nearly identical saddle racks. Henry's dog Chester came with him, and caused considerable controversy with James's cat, a situation that resolved itself after 4 days into a state of fragile coexistence that everyone agreed to accept. The combined properties were legally registered under a joint deed in both their names at the Harlan Creek Land Office, with Elmer Grady doing his slow, careful stamping with a gravity appropriate to the moment. It felt, to Caroline, like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, which was exactly what it was. Spring came early that year, a gift after the hard winter, with rains in late February and March that were generous without being destructive, and by April the grass on both properties was the kind of green that made a rancher weak in the knees. The cattle were moved to summer pasture. The fences that had started all of this were checked and reinforced. The household that Caroline and Henry were building together began to settle into its own rhythms, its particular daily patterns of work and rest, and the small ceremonies that make up a life. Henry and James had developed a project that spring, an expansion of the cattle operation to include a small horse breeding program. James had always had a particular gift with horses, a patience and instinct that Henry had spotted early, and the two of them together had the complementary skills for it. James's natural aptitude and Henry's experience with the business side of working with breeders in Tennessee. Caroline managed the books and the planning calendar and the careful balancing of investment against income that a growing operation required, and she did it with the precision and creativity that had kept the Langston homestead alive through drought and grief and Margaret Pollard. She had learned from Thomas and she had learned from necessity, and she was, by any honest measure, very good at it. The three of them worked together with a coherence that had developed without anyone engineering it. That was just the natural outcome of three capable people who respected each other's abilities, and the work had the particular satisfaction of a thing that is going in the right direction. In the evenings, when James had retired to his room with the book that Henry had started ordering for him from a bookseller in San Antonio, Caroline and Henry sat on the porch and talked. They talked about the same things they always had, the practical and the personal, the work and the wider world, the news that came in the weekly paper from Austin about the changes sweeping Texas as the cattle frontier began to give way to fencing and settlement, and the encroachment of the railroad. They talked about James's future, his clear intelligence, and the question of how to give him access to more education than Harlan Creek could provide. They talked about their own future, about what they wanted the property to look like in 5 years, in 10. And sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, Henry reading and Caroline mending, or simply watching the sky go dark over the western hills. And the silence was full in the way only the silence between people who have chosen each other can be full. In May, Caroline told Henry she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning, practically, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, because she was a practical woman and he was a practical man, and that was the appropriate mode for important news. She had known for 3 weeks and had said nothing until she was certain. Henry set down his cup. He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face cycled through surprise and something deeper and more complex before arriving at an uncomplicated, radiant happiness that was more openly emotional than she had seen from him before. "Caroline," he said, and stopped, apparently finding further words insufficient. "I know," she said, and she was smiling. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and then changed his mind about that and put his arms around her, carefully, as though she were something precious, which was annoying because she was not fragile and also the most touching thing he had ever done. "Stop treating me like glass," she said into his shoulder. "I'm not," he said, his voice slightly uneven. "I'm treating you like someone I love who has just given me the best news I've ever heard." She wrapped her arms around him and held on. Outside the kitchen window, the morning light was moving across the south pasture in that particular spring way, bright and provisional, full of the suggestion of everything that might still happen. James took the news with the characteristic restraint of a 16-year-old boy confronting the concrete reality of his mother's marriage, which was to say he went very quiet, nodded 3 times, said "That's good, I suppose," and then went out to the barn for 20 minutes. He came back in afterward and was entirely himself again, and Caroline decided not to examine the 20 minutes too closely. He would get there in his own time. He got there faster than expected. By June, he had started calling Henry by his name in conversation, rather than the careful circumlocution he'd been using, and by July, he had shifted to a comfortable shorthand that required no honorifics at all, and there was something in that unself-conscious shift that Caroline found more moving than any formal declaration would have been. The summer of 1880 was different from the summer before. The land was productive, the cattle were healthy, the horse breeding operation had its first real success with 2 foals that showed the promise Henry and James had been working toward. The books were better than they'd been in 2 years. The work was hard and satisfying, and done with the particular efficiency of a household that had found its internal logic. Caroline's pregnancy progressed through the Texas summer heat with the robustness she applied to most things, not without difficulty, not without the various discomforts that were the honest reality of expecting a child, but with the pragmatic management of a woman who had a ranch to run and was not going to let her own body's inconvenience become a crisis. Henry hovered at the edges of this, wanting to help and being managed with patient firmness each time he tried to do more than was invited. "I'm going to ride out to the north pasture," Caroline said one August morning. "It's 90 degrees, Henry said. "I've ridden in 90 degrees before, many times." "You weren't, Henry," she said. He stopped. "I will not be reckless," she said. I will take water and I will not push too hard and I will come back within 2 hours. But I need to see the north pasture fence because James said there's a section down and I want to assess it myself." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man conducting a careful internal negotiation. "I'll come with you," he said finally. "That's fine," she said. They rode out together, which was, in the end, what usually happened when they had these negotiations. The fence was down exactly where James had said it was, and needed exactly the work they both could see it needed, and they spent an hour in the summer heat making the repairs, and rode back under the blue-white Texas sky with the comfortable competence of people who know how to do the thing they are doing. October brought the second annual cattle drive. Caroline did not ride this one all the way to Abilene, which was a concession to the reality of being 7 months along, and the judgment, shared by Henry, James, and her own body, that 10 days in the saddle was past the point of pragmatic. She stayed and managed the homestead and the remaining stock, and Henry and James took the combined herd north with 3 reliable hands, and were back in 16 days with the season's income. And James reported Henry had not slept properly for most of the drive because he was thinking about her. "He told you that?" Caroline asked. "He didn't have to," James said. "I have eyes." The child came in November. It was a long labor, longer than she'd hoped, and the midwife who attended it, a capable woman named Mrs. Harcourt who had been delivering babies in Harlan Creek County for 20 years, was steady and confident in the way of someone for whom this was difficult but not unprecedented. Henry spent the entire night in the kitchen with James, both of them performing the particular male act of doing absolutely nothing useful while pretending they might at any moment be called upon to do something vital. The baby arrived in the gray early morning, when the frost was on the grass and the roosters were just beginning. He was a boy, solid and loud, with Henry's dark hair and Caroline's expression of determined seriousness that appeared, somewhat improbably, immediately upon entering the world. Mrs. Harcourt announced this outcome with professional satisfaction. Henry came through the door with permission and stopped in the middle of the room as though he'd forgotten how to walk, looking at Caroline in the bed with the bundle in her arms, and Caroline looked back at him with the exhausted, complete serenity of someone who has just accomplished something enormous. "Come here," she said. Henry crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for the first time, and whatever he felt was larger than his capacity for language, which was fine, because some things don't need language. "His name is Thomas Henry," Caroline said, "if that's all right." Henry looked up at her, and his eyes were bright in a way that he did not try to conceal. "It's more than all right," he said. "It's right." James came in and looked at the baby with the wary fascination of a boy who is being asked to recalibrate his understanding of his own life, and said, after a long moment, "He looks like a very old man." "All babies look like very old men," Caroline said. "You did too." "I did not," James said, but without conviction. Thomas Henry Holloway grew as babies grow, fast and noisy, and with an absolute confidence in the centrality of his own needs that his mother found both exhausting and deeply familiar, because she had raised James and recognized the pattern. James was, to everyone's mild surprise and no one's real surprise, excellent with the baby. He had the patience with Thomas that he did with horses, quiet and instinctive, and Thomas, from very early, would stop crying when James held him in a way that he did not always stop for Henry, which Henry found both baffling and slightly hilarious. "The cattle drive partnership has real competition," Henry said one evening, watching James walking the length of the front room with Thomas on his shoulder, both of them perfectly content. "James has always been remarkable with things smaller than himself," Caroline said. "It's everything his own size or larger that he's difficult about." Henry laughed. She loved his laugh, she had discovered. It was quieter than you might expect from a man of his size, and it came from genuine amusement rather than performance. "That," Henry said, "is exactly true of most people. The months after Thomas Henry's arrival had the full, dense quality of a life that is being lived at capacity. There was always something happening, something requiring attention, something new. The horse breeding program had its second season and produced results that were attracting attention from buyers as far as San Antonio. The cattle operation continued to expand by the careful, incremental method that Henry favored: another 20 head, a new section of improved pasture, better management of the water resources on both ends of the combined property. James turned 17 and was corresponding with a school in Austin that Henry had identified as offering exactly the kind of practical education in land management and animal science that could formalize the gifts James already had. He was not ready to leave yet, not while Thomas was so young and the operation needed him, but the plan was in place, and that mattered, having a plan that pointed toward something. In the spring of 1881, Caroline stood at her kitchen window watching Henry and James in the south yard, Henry with Thomas on his hip and James gesturing at something in the distance, some feature of the landscape that he was apparently explaining with great enthusiasm, and Henry nodding and asking questions, and Thomas reaching for James's hat in the determined way he reached for everything. She thought about the morning in the land office, nearly 2 years past now, the 48 minutes, the stamped document, the woman who had walked in trying to take what wasn't hers. She thought about the creek bank in September and the cattle drive and the December evening on the porch. She thought about the strongbox in Thomas's papers and the discharged lien that had saved everything and the February wedding and the first time James had called Henry by his name without thinking about it. All of it leading here. All of it adding up to this. A South Texas morning, the grass green from recent rain, her husband and her sons in the yard below, the smell of coffee in the kitchen, and the particular light of the hill country in spring making everything look exactly as much itself as it could be. She was not a woman given to melodrama. She did not make grand internal speeches about gratitude or the unexpected gifts of life. But she allowed herself, standing at that window, to feel the full weight of it, the beautiful, hard-won completeness of what she had built and rebuilt and refused to let be taken from her. The back door opened and Henry came in with Thomas, who immediately held out his arms for his mother with the imperious confidence of a 1-year-old who expects his expectations to be met. Caroline took him and settled him on her hip, and Henry stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with that expression she had first learned to read on a creek bank and now knew as well as her own name. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her on the temple, which made Thomas attempt to push him away with a small, offended hand, which made both his parents laugh, which startled Thomas into uncertain silence for a moment before he decided laughing was also permissible, and joined in with the particular unself-conscious delight of babies who don't know yet that joy is supposed to be complicated. Summer came again, as it always did, hot and demanding and full of work. The Holloway operation had grown to something that felt, at last, genuinely solid, not just surviving but building, not just managing difficulty but creating something that had momentum and direction and a future. The horse breeding program had developed a reputation that Henry had not entirely expected and was quietly very proud of. James was its most effective ambassador, talking to potential buyers with the earnest expertise of someone who has been learning this since before he knew he was learning it. Margaret Pollard, for what it was worth, had become a minor key background presence in Harlan Creek rather than the threat she'd once been. She attended Sunday service. She maintained her guest house. She had made several investments in town that were genuinely beneficial: a new well, a contribution to the school construction fund, and Caroline suspected that after her failed campaign against the Holloway properties, she had concluded that certain kinds of fighting were not worth the expense and redirected her considerable energies more productively. She and Caroline were not friends. They were polite, which was sufficient. In September, 2 years after the cattle drive where Henry had told Caroline he loved her beside a fire in the open country, Caroline told him she was expecting again. He received this news with the same joy as the first time and somewhat less paralysis, which was the appropriate evolution. "Another one," James said when told, in a tone that conveyed complex emotions compressed into 2 words. "Another one," Caroline confirmed. James looked at Thomas, who was playing on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon in a manner suggesting its highest possible use was as a percussion instrument. "I suppose I'll get used to it," James said. "You will," Henry said and clapped him on the shoulder. "You're surprisingly good at it." James tried not to look pleased about this and mostly failed. The second child came in April of 1882, a daughter this time, who arrived with the unhurried grace of someone not in a particular hurry and immediately demonstrated, in her first weeks, a temperament that was distinctly her own, watchful and patient and occasionally devastating in its precision. They named her Clara after old Clara Medina, who was still in Harlan Creek, and was the first person outside the family to hold the baby, at Caroline's express invitation. Clara Medina held the baby Clara Holloway and said something in Spanish that her grandson translated as approximately, "She is going to be a great deal of trouble in the best possible way," which everyone agreed was both accurate and appropriate. Thomas Henry, nearly 2, inspected his sister with deep suspicion that gradually over the course of weeks converted itself into a proprietary attachment that expressed itself primarily as wanting to show her things, presenting her with objects of interest, rocks and sticks, and a single somewhat battered pinecone, with the generous certainty of someone who has decided you are worth educating. James went to Austin in the fall of 1882 for his first term at the school they'd been planning for. He was 18 years old, broad-shouldered like his late father and taller than either of his parents, and he left with a trunk of clothes and books and enough practical knowledge to have run most cattle operations in South Texas already. He came back for Christmas and filled the house with his presence and his opinions and his stories about Austin, and went back in January with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going. Caroline stood on the porch watching his horse disappear down the road and felt the particular bittersweet pride of a mother watching her child move into his own life, sad and right in equal measure. Henry stood beside her with Clara on his hip and Thomas holding his other hand. "He's going to be extraordinary," Henry said. "He already is," Caroline said. She took his free hand and they stood there for a moment, the 4 of them on the porch, watching the road where James had been. The years moved forward with the steady rhythm of well-tended land. The Holloway operation continued to grow, the horse breeding program becoming a genuine regional reputation, the cattle side stabilizing at a comfortable and profitable size. Henry and Caroline found their respective domains within the shared enterprise, complementary rather than competitive, each trusting the other's judgment in their area of expertise. They argued, as honest people who share a life argue, about money and timing and decisions, and the occasional personality conflict that is the natural product of 2 strong-willed people who are very close for a very long time. The arguments were real and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they had in common the habit of honesty and the shared knowledge that what they were protecting was worth the discomfort of working through it. James came home from Austin in the spring of 1884 with a certificate from the school, a wider vocabulary, 2 new opinions about everything, and a young woman named Ruth, whom he introduced with the careful casualness of someone who has been practicing this introduction and is now performing it under pressure. Ruth was 20, the daughter of an Austin land surveyor, with the direct gaze and capable hands of someone who had grown up in a working household and was not intimidated by the prospect of another one. She shook Caroline's hand firmly and met Henry's eyes without flinching and picked Thomas up when he fell over in the yard and set him back on his feet with brisk, efficient kindness. Caroline liked her within the first hour. Henry liked her slightly faster than that. James, reading their expressions, visibly relaxed. The two of them were married in Austin the following year, at Ruth's family's church, with Caroline and Henry and the children making the journey north in the good wagon that Henry had acquired 2 springs prior. Thomas Henry, 5 years old, wore his best clothes with the martyred expression of a child who is being required to be presentable, and Clara, 3, was so enchanted by the flowers in the church that she had to be retrieved from attempting to relocate them on 3 separate occasions. It was a good wedding. James looked at Ruth the way Caroline had seen Henry look at her, and she understood completely that this was exactly right. Returning to Harlan Creek from Austin, with Henry driving the wagon and Thomas asleep on the bench between them and Clara asleep across their laps in a manner that was simultaneously inconvenient and absolutely not to be disturbed, Caroline watched the Texas Hill Country slide past in the late afternoon light and thought, not for the first time, about how much had changed. The land office, the 48 minutes, the cold certainty of Margaret Pollard's voice saying, "Why, Caroline?" And the sound of the door slamming open and Henry Holloway standing in the threshold, chest heaving from the hard ride, his dark eyes finding her across the room. He had never moved faster, she thought. Not before and not since. He had ridden to her before she had asked, before she had known to ask, driven by some instinct that was older than strategy, the simple, urgent need to be where someone needed him. She looked at him now, settled and familiar beside her on the wagon bench, his hat pushed back the way it always was, his hands easy on the reins, and felt the accumulated weight of everything they had been to each other, the neighbors and the rivals in the competition of trusting, the friends and the partners and the people who had chosen each other specifically, not out of necessity or proximity, but out of the clear recognition of something worth choosing. He turned his head and caught her looking. "What?" he said. "I was thinking about the land office," she said. He considered this. "The 48 minutes. The door," she said. "The way you came through it." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon rocked over a rut in the road and Clara made a small noise of protest in her sleep and resettled. "I was terrified I wasn't going to get there in time," Henry said. "Why?" Caroline asked. "You didn't have anything at stake in that filing." He looked at her with the expression she knew as well as her own face in the mirror. "I did," he said simply. She leaned against his shoulder. His arm moved around her, adjusting the reins to one hand, easy and automatic. Thomas stirred between them and then relaxed again, small and warm and present. The road unrolled toward Harlan Creek, toward the homestead with its weathered green shutters and its south pasture, and the creek that ran along the east boundary, and the barn where James and Henry had spent a whole summer building what they'd needed, toward the community of people who had witnessed and supported and occasionally complicated their life together, toward everything that was theirs. The sun was setting in front of them, the particular southwestern Texas sunset that went through 6 shades of orange and pink before settling into the deep blue that preceded full dark, and it lit the hills ahead of them in warm gold, the same color as the lamplight in Thomas Langston's old study, where they had found the discharge paper that saved everything, the same color as the fire on the cattle drive where Henry had said "I love you" without strategy or preamble, the same color as the morning light through the kitchen window where Caroline had stood and watched her husband and her boys in the yard, and understood that she had built something real. Harlan Creek appeared in the valley below them as the last light was going, its small cluster of buildings lit from within, the church steeple and the general store, and the land office where everything had pivoted and everything had begun. Henry brought the wagon down the hill and through the town, and out the other side onto the familiar road toward home, and the horses knew it, moved with the eager efficiency of animals who understand the concept of the last stretch, and the wagon rolled through the dark under a wide Texas sky full of stars. Thomas woke up as they pulled into the yard and announced this with a question about whether there was something to eat, and Clara woke because Thomas woke, and attempted immediately to continue the flower relocation project she had been planning since the Austin church. And Henry and Caroline navigated the organized chaos of arriving home with children and luggage and animals who needed attending. The entirely ordinary, entirely extraordinary business of a household that is full. Later, much later, when the children were asleep and the horses settled and the house quiet, Caroline and Henry sat on the porch in the cool October air, close together, the way they always sat, and the stars overhead were the same stars that had been there on the cattle drive and the creek bank and every evening on this porch for 5 years of evenings and would be there for every evening to come. "Tell me something," Caroline said. "Anything," Henry said. She thought about it. "Tell me something you haven't told me yet." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking beside her, the particular quality of his thinking silences, which she had learned to distinguish from his comfortable silences, from his tired silences. "I knew," he said finally, "at the general store, when you helped Clara Medina and I didn't know you were watching, and I turned around and there you were behind the dry goods display with this expression on your face that I had never seen before on anyone. I knew then." She stared at him. "That was March, months before we spoke properly. I know. Why didn't you? Because you were still in your first year of grief," he said simply. "Because I was not going to be the man who rushed you, because I told you from the beginning that the pace would be whatever pace you needed." She looked at him in the dark. "You waited. I would have waited longer," he said, "as long as it needed to be." The stars turned overhead, and the Harlan Creek hills were dark and quiet and solid, and the house behind them was full of sleeping children and the accumulated warmth of 5 years of honest living. And Caroline Langston Holloway sat beside the man she had chosen and who had chosen her, who had come through a door at the right moment and stayed, and thought that, whatever the land office and Margaret Pollard and the competing claims and the water rights and all of it had cost, it had cost exactly the right price to purchase exactly this. She took his hand. He held it, and the night settled around them complete and good. In the years that followed, Harlan Creek grew and changed, as Texas was growing and changing, more fences and more settlements, and the railroad coming closer every year. The Holloway operation adjusted with the changes, as good ranchers do, shifting emphasis, learning new methods, staying ahead of the shifts in the market and the land. Henry and Caroline made those adjustments together, as they made every significant decision, in conversation, honestly, with the practical wisdom of people who have learned to plan from a foundation of mutual trust. James and Ruth settled in Austin, where James had established himself in land management and appraisal, using the skills Caroline had taught him, and the formal education Henry had made possible, and the instincts that were simply his own. They had children, a son first and then 2 daughters, and the family between Harlan Creek and Austin was connected by the regular letters and the visits that were never quite long enough. Thomas Henry grew into a boy, and then a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and a talent for horses that exceeded even James's gift, a particular kind of communion with them that people who saw it called magical and Henry called the product of 10,000 hours of patient attention. He stayed close to the homestead longer than James had, partly by choice and partly by aptitude, and became the natural inheritor of the horse breeding program that he eventually turned into the best-regarded operation of its kind in south-central Texas. Clara grew into a young woman with old Clara Medina's name and something of her quality, watchful and patient and occasionally devastating, and she became, at 20, a schoolteacher in Harlan Creek, which was a profession that suited her exactly. She taught the children of the town with the same brisk, efficient kindness that she had shown a 5-year-old Thomas at a wedding in Austin, and became, over time, someone the community could not imagine having done without. Henry and Caroline grew into their 40s and their 50s with the mutual ease of people who have been growing together long enough that the growing itself has become the relationship. They were different than they had been at 30, which was the point of living. They had the particular contentment of people who have done the thing they set out to do, not perfectly, not without loss, but honestly and well, and who can look at what they have built and see in it the accurate reflection of what they meant to build. On the morning of their 20th wedding anniversary, February of 1900, Henry and Caroline sat at the kitchen table in the same house where they had sat 20 years earlier going through Thomas Langston's strongbox, where James had announced Henry's intended proposal with the certainty of a 16-year-old, where Thomas Henry had been born and Clara had toddled on the floor, and 100 mornings had passed in the ordinary, extraordinary rhythm of a life. Henry had made coffee. Caroline had burned the first batch of biscuits and made a second batch, and refused to acknowledge the first batch had happened. The house was quieter than it had once been. Thomas Henry had his own house on the property now, 100 yards east of the main house, and Clara had rooms in town near the school. But it was not a sad quiet. It was the quiet of a morning that belongs to two people who know each other fully and are comfortable in that knowledge. Henry looked at Caroline across the table with the same expression he had worn at the land office in the autumn of 1879, on a creek bank in September, on a porch in December, at a church in February. Older now, 20 years of sun and work and weather, and all of it honest, all of it real. "Happy anniversary," he said. "20 years," she said. "I'd do every one of them again," Henry said. She looked at him. 30 years of knowing him, she thought, knowing how he moved and how he thought and how he laughed and what his silences meant and what made him reach across a kitchen table to cover her hand with his, knowing the shape of him in all the ways that time teaches you the shape of a person. "So would I," she said, "every single one." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture, always the same gesture, warm and certain and unhurried. Outside the kitchen window, the February morning was bright and cold, the hill country laid out in its winter colors, the grass amber and the sky blue and the creek catching light where it ran along the east boundary, the same creek, the same light, the same land that she had refused to let be taken from her and that had given her, in the keeping, more than she had known to ask for. The coffee steamed in their cups. The biscuits cooled on the rack. Somewhere in the distance, a horse called out from Thomas Henry's direction, the sound rolling clear through the cold morning air. Caroline Holloway sat at her kitchen table in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the first year of a new century, holding the hand of the man who had come through a door fast on an October morning in 1879 and had never, in 30 years of the daily choosing, given her reason to wish he hadn't. And she was, in every way that a person can be when the hard work has been done, and the right choices have been made, and the life has been lived honestly and well, entirely, completely, and without reservation, home.